just to introduce myself, I'm Sue Percy. I'm the CEO of CIHT, and really want to talk to you and share with you some of the work we've been doing about the future for transport planners and our research around CIHT futures. And I want to sort of really talk to you a little bit about some of the thinking around the skills, tools and techniques that we're going to need to navigate because we know we're in a period of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is not going to lessen. And as transport planners, as people in the sector, we need to, I think, adapt much more than we have perhaps previously to this changing world. The buzzword cited everywhere at the moment clearly is around uncertainty. And we are all certain about uncertainty, it seems. And clearly, J.F. Kennedy, a number of years ago, talked about there's nothing as uncertain, as unchanging as uncertainty and change. And actually, I think that's a really useful sort of quote to start from. And he goes on to say the only reason to give a speech is to change the world. Well, I'm not sure that this morning we're going to change the world, but we might sort of have a bit of a discussion about some of the changing thinking that we need to do as we go forward. So our industry has been recognising changing times for a number of years. And I really want to just sort of start by talking about maybe three particular seminal reports I think really sort of set the scene for some of this change and some of the things that we need to do differently. And the first report is called Future Demand, and this originates from New Zealand, where their Ministry of Transport, as part of their strategic policy programme, investigated uncertainty and changing times in transport. This was published in 2014. And the findings from this were actually reported to CIHT's council by Professor Glenn Lyons, who did the work in New Zealand. And CIHT decided that actually the work that had been done was so important that we commissioned Glenn to do a similar piece of work for us here in the UK. And that culminated in 11 workshops and over 200 participants. And it led to the uncertainty ahead, which way forward for transport, and that was published 2 years ago. And I'm going to cover some of the findings of that report as we go along today. Also want to just draw your attention to another report that I think is really, really important and would encourage you to read, and that's by Professor Greg Marsden, and that's the Commission for Travel Demand report, All Change, and that was published in May this year. Now, it's 55 pages long. It's excellent, and I do recommend it to you, so do have a look at it. Ooh. Now, we know the future is uncertain, and we know that because we talk a lot about technology, we talk a lot about the way we work and how that's changing, and the way that we buy products, for example, is changing, and the way we want to live is changing. So, we know workers are commuting to work fewer times a week. We know that online shopping takes account of, at the moment, about 17 to 20% of all retail sales, and we know the impact of that because of all the stuff around, retail at the moment. And we know the average distance travelled has risen by about 10%. And so the workshops that Glenn conducted with CIHT recognised these changes and highlighted the fact that we need to reflect these changes in the decision making and the tools that we use. And I suppose the question for Glenn and for us is, but how do we do that? How do we know about these things, but how do we then bring that into the way that we make decisions, the way that we work? Because often what you see is all this change around you, and we continue decision making in the same similar way. And of course, other factors have changed. And certainly these sentiments were echoed loudly in the All Change report, and where it set out a number of recommendations. Now, turning now to the skills that we need. So this is about what do we need to now introduce into our skill set to cope with uncertainty. Well, I think one of the most important things that we need to recognise is around our biases, because our biases, we all have them, and they all affect our decision making. And if we don't address them and we don't acknowledge them, then we will continue doing the same things the same old ways. And we know, and we're clear that that probably isn't the best way to approach working in such an uncertain environment. So if we stick with what we know and what we're comfortable with, then planning for the future means that we need to be seeking fresh evidence in often unfamiliar territory. So we have to go out of our normal comfort zone. Particularly at the moment, we have to engage much more with all the technology innovators outside of our sector. So what we tend to do is we quite often push a plan or a project because of its history. We can be reluctant to go or let it go if we've invested in huge amounts of time and money. And this is known as a sunk cost fallacy. And we've all done that, haven't we? We've all sort of said, well, we need to keep pushing this forward because we've all, been working at this project for X number of years. And it's not necessarily the right decision. Another bias is around confirmation. And this creeps in when we want to validate all our assumptions, whether they're applicable in the future or not. So it's around really being able to embrace alternative views and reflect on whether our decisions are made in the right context. And the third bias, I suppose, is what we call cognitive fluency. This is the one that actually we all tend to get excited about concepts which are quite straightforward and tend to shy away from the ones that are slightly more complex. And this is what a natural human response. And the research shows that actually we need to question whether the propositions is really as good as it sounds just because we can understand it. So these questioning skills around let's think about our biases and question them, not particularly encouraged in our industry. And certainly when you talk to some of the different age groups, certain age groups in our sector are much more keen to question than others. And, it's normally our younger professionals who will question, and some of our more mature professionals who actually don't want to do that. Now, that's not always the case, but it is something that we need to be aware of. So top tip really is, as it says on the slide, give a voice to different generations of professionals and examine the future of and avoid bias. Now, this is part of an inclusion agenda in the workplace, actually bringing in different viewpoints from different people. So, in order to explain effectively, we need to learn to expose the uncertainty and plan flexibly. So, key questions that I think we need to ask ourselves when we're thinking about decision making is, well, what will society want in the future? And according to Uber, as many of you will well know, we will want to hail flying taxis in the future. And certainly there are trials being conducted certainly in the next couple of years in Dallas, Dubai and Los Angeles. So forget about autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles on the road system. We'll just be moving around in flying taxis. So how will we want our places to be? And of course it's predicted that 70% of our population is going to be urban based by 2030. So what does that mean, and what does that mean we'll need to do? And certainly from a technical perspective, we need to plan for uncertainty and be conscious of these false accuracies, because we do tend to get a bit fixated by 2 decimal places sometimes. And actually in the scheme of things, that's not the way that we need to move forward. And certainly the Secretary of State for Transport starts to recognise this, I think, when he approved the Silvertown Tunnel. And you can see the quote on there. And he says there's no merit in refusing the application based on uncertainties around traffic modelling, air quality, because these uncertainties are likely to remain in any new application. And he also goes on to say that refreshed assessment and reacting to impacts through the monitoring and mitigation strategy certified as part of the consent order is the way forward. So this continuous loop going back, so rechecking, just checking that actually some of the assumptions we've made are they actually playing out? Do we need to modify? Do we need to change? So those are some of the biases we need to think about. We also need to think about some of our decision pathways we use. So the All Change report that I mentioned a bit earlier states that predict and provide, which is what we tend to use, should really be replaced by decide and provide. So moving away from predict and provide to decide and provide. So what that really is saying is that we need to decide what we want to achieve and then consider the infrastructure required. And a lot of the way we do, we sort of we have models that say we're predicting this, and so we then go and plan for that and the infrastructure. And this model is sort of saying, actually, let's decide what we want and then plan for that. And I think if you move to that sort of decide and provide, one of the key skills that we will need to demonstrate in abundance is strong leadership. Because we will need to create a vision and we will need to create the right environment to achieve that vision. And I don't know if any of you have read the book by Matthew Syed, Black Box Thinking. Probably not, there's no nods here at all. But it's about marginal gains and the secret of high performance. And it's not a usual management book or self-help book, and it compares systems of different organisations and what impacts the systems have. So it talks about closed systems where challenge is thwarted and failure covered up, and he quotes the NHS, compared to learning organisations, and again he quotes aviation, for example, and this is what he has to say. Science is not just about method, it's about mindset. And in a lot of the talks, we keep hearing about mindset and the need for change. At its best, it's driven by a restless spirit and intellectual courage, a willingness to face up to failures and to be honest about key data, even if it undermines cherished beliefs. So it's quite a challenging thing, this idea of a learning organisation. And certainly when we look at certain decisions and certain outcomes, often we know that things have been covered up and only emerge. And you can think of your own examples around that, and some very well publicised things where things have just been covered up until the point where you can't rescue them and things collapse. So we talked about some of the skills. Just want to turn and talk a little bit about perhaps some of the tools that we might want to have at our disposal. Now, traditional traffic models often take a beating. We often find that they're criticised, and quite rightly so sometimes, but not always. And one of the problems I think the industry has is that it uses the roles in a right and wrong way. And certainly the panel report for Silvertown Tunnel reminds us of what the correct approach should be. So, top-down approach for forecasting future demand, which is what often happens, so top-down, is very enduring. It's difficult to move away from that. But the regional and local impacts happen to not always be taken into account. And maybe with the different governance that's coming through in transport, that will change quite a lot. And certainly the All Change report states that where technical capacity exists, it is better to build assessments from the bottom up rather than the top down. And it offers a different approach where different assumptions to schemes can be demonstrated. And so this leads nicely into the next tool, the evidence base. The reduction in miles travelled and trips made is seen across the whole of the UK. Timings and extent of reductions differ across the country. So we see sheer towns, metropolitan areas, resort towns and rural areas, that have highest mileage, as you would suspect, and then the metropolitan areas and cities having the lower and absolute reductions in travel. And obviously, density plays an important role here, as do the availability of different modes of transport. But we need to have a better understanding of what is happening at the local level if we're going to decide and provide the infrastructure, rather than just try and predict and provide the infrastructure. So what the evidence is suggesting, what the reports are suggesting, is that we need to build up the evidence from the outcomes of the projects and policies. And certainly DFT is seeking to increase its monitoring programme, and HE through POPE provides evidence on schemes, impacts on year of opening and then fifth year. But to be high performers, we need to be able to obtain and use data from a number of sources. And Greg Marsden's All Change Report recommends a change here. They recommend something called a Futures Laboratory, Futures Lab. Thinks that needs to be created that supports integrated learning, including rapid evidence-based reviews of changes in social and technological issues. Because the rate of change of some of these things is so fast, we tend to lag behind, and we're still then making decisions on evidence that is already outdated. The next technique, which you might already be familiar, is scenario planning, and using scenario planning in decision making. It's not new. Certainly it was developed by Shell in the 1970s. And this technique seeks to reveal uncertainty, not conceal it, but to actually bring it to the fore, and use it in the case of forecasting, and use it in the case of how we plan going forward. So the focal question for future demand is, how could or should our transport systems evolve in order to support mobility in the future? Now, Greg Lyons and Transport Scotland are using this scenario planning at the moment on their future thinking. We know that Transport for Greater Manchester, Devon County Council and TfL are using these techniques to do their planning as well. So just have a look at this slide and see if you can take it in for a few seconds. So what it illustrates is the different scenarios that CIHT's Futures looked at. And it basically rests on the scenario around energy costs as a matrix. So you've got running through the centre from the top to the bottom, you've got relative cost of energy from low to high. And then across the centre, horizontal, you've got accessibility preference from physical to virtual. And within those four grids, you've got different scenarios. And the first one on the top left is cooperative and closed. Now, this is a future scenario where you've got high energy costs and a preference by society for face-to-face connectivity. And what that means, and it dictates need for proximity and need to seek efficiencies in resource use through cooperative behaviours. So the sharing economy comes to mind when you're looking at this particular scenario. Then on the right-hand side, you've got the global locals. Again, high energy costs and high use of technology. So the preference there is then for virtual connectivity. You've also got on the, on the lower right, digital decadence, and this is high energy costs, low energy costs and high virtual world. And then on the bottom left, you've got the traveller's paradise, low costs and high preference for travel. I think this is probably very related to the US. They seem to love the traveller's paradise. So each one of these has a reduction in travel apart from the traveller's paradise. And yet, when we plan and when we think about a lot of the traffic models, it's predicting more and more growth in travel. Yeah, if you look at this scenario planning, and depending on the assumptions that you use, there is a clear challenge to that. And it's not necessarily that we will go along the traveller paradise route, or we will have increasing travel in all areas. So the plausibility of each scenario is examined and the uncertainties unveiled. And certainly Transport Scotland are using this sort of technique to help to really think about their planning for transport in Scotland over the next few years. To really think about, okay, well, we're going to think differently about this. We're going to take a much more, let's decide, and then let's look at scenario planning of what might be coming through. So we have other techniques as well that we should include. And this one comes from Norwegian government. And this is around putting policy first. And this is about a proactive or positive decide and provide approach. And they're using this very much to think about the kind of investment do they need to make their cities thrive without growing traffic. Okay. So they're really taking a very proactive, let's decide, this is what we want, these are the things that are important to us, and how are we going to then build that in. Another technique that's being used at the moment is the one around working iteratively. So you monitor and adapt schemes and strategies. And that's very much advocated by the Dutch, by Greater Manchester, and also seen that in the Secretary of State's quote around Silvertown, this idea that by monitoring we need to then adapt and move forward. Just to sort of then think about our government, certainly in Westminster, and what we see is something quite interesting happening here, and certainly in the consultation on WebTag, which some of you might be familiar with, which is looking at appraisal and modelling strategy around informing future transport investment decisions. If you look at it, the extent to which there was a recognition of underpinning uncertainty in the future was much more prevalent than we've seen in the past. So tools such as scenario planning and other tools were actively being proposed. And I think that's quite a shift for DFT from what we've been seeing in the past. So just to sort of finish off some of the results and conclusions from our futures work, I think the key message from the work that Glenn Lyons did, not only in New Zealand and here in the UK with us, but also from Greg Marsden's report, is around we need to learn to ask far more questions. We need to be questioning, and we need clarity around what's required in changing times. And certainly we need to think much more about what is it that we're trying to plan for, and what is it and what type of infrastructure investment do we need to then match to allow that future, and what is our vision? If we don't have a vision, then we're not going to really be able to plan successfully. And I'll leave you with a last quote, and I've gone to the next session, the last quote, and I think it's a really, really good quote. It's not up on here, but I'll just talk to you about it. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And that was Henry Ford. And I think actually that's a good place just to finish what I wanted to say this morning to you. So thank you very much. And I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts or any things that you were doing around managing in an uncertain world. Yeah. I think there's a mic.
Just a quick one about your getting new insights from people outside there. My name's Eric Masaba.
Yeah.
I'm from a company called Texi. 12 years ago, I came up with the idea of using a mobile phone to hail a cab and
Yes.
geolocate people. Filed a
Yes.
patent, 27
Yes.
citations. I've been ignored by the CIHT, DFT, everyone. Glenn Lyons actually gave me a few times to present at UWE Bristol and also Plymouth, which was great.
Yeah.
But what I'm suggesting is that we combine ideas from the military, investment banking, and also the internet to do a new type of road space-time pricing. So
Yeah.
I'd love to share some of those ideas with anyone who wants to know.
Yeah, well, we'd certainly like to. I'm sorry if we've ignored you in the past. Certainly not consciously in terms of certainly under my tenure. But we have a number of interest groups, topic groups, and one is our technology and innovation panel, who I'm sure would be interested in hearing some of your thoughts on that. And my colleague Andrew at the back, who's waving now, is probably the person to talk to take that forward a little bit. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Hugh Gillis, Transport Scotland. This is more a kind of challenge to myself than to you, because I'm director of the trunk roads in Scotland. But I think it's a challenge to all public authorities, whether national or local. And my point is this: we've talked very eloquent, we heard very eloquently from yourself about the future and future scoping. But I think as society moves along, there's the front of the bubble, as I would describe it, with the early adopters and disruptive technologies, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also a fall-off back, the DVD John Lewis last to give up thing. And it's how do we manage both? Because we need to provide transport services for the front of the bubble, the way you're describing, but also the back is... And that's going to be that challenge is going to be even bigger.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's a bit like the when we talk about autonomous and connected vehicles, it's the bit in the middle that's very, very messy, and I'm not sure we have particular answers to that. And it's around recognising what we've got and how that will move forward over the next few years, to the point where we can be more proactive about affecting change in the future. I don't know what that answer is. If anyone does, postcards to Hugh, please, with your thinking. That's really, really difficult. I don't know if you've been talking about that in Scotland, of coming up with any ideas of how to unpick that.
To be honest, we have been... I mean, it's been interesting to come the last couple of days here. Everything's seems calf-tastic and mass-tastic here, and that's been the same at a lot of these conferences, and it's good that we have to think about these things, but to the point where actually we're going to regroup across all our directorates, along with Roy, our chief exec, and go, right, what is, as a national transport authority, how are we going to try and chunk this up and start to come up with a strategy to think about the short, medium, long term?
Yeah. I think that comes back to the point around... because it is challenging, it is around leadership and a vision, and being able to develop that vision and take people with you on that, and having the not only the leadership but also the political buy-in to be able to do that, because some of this isn't easy, because it's easy to default back to what we have tried and tested and feel comfortable with. That sort of bias around, well, I know about this, I know what I'm going to get out of the end of this, and to move into this other work where it's less certain, and you're having to more proactively think about that vision and decide, and the politics around that is very challenging indeed. Anything else? No? Okay, and I think I've been given the nod that actually our time is up anyway. So thank you all very much indeed, and do come and talk to us on our stand if you want to think a little bit more around different ways and approaches to future transport planning. So thank you.